I'm Austin Lugo.
I'm Andrew Harp.
This is With Nothing to Say.
Let's talk about the discreet charm of the bourgeoisie.
Before we get started today, just a quick shout out to our friends at Ferrand on Film. This is a really interesting, cool podcast. It's by a film teacher and former student, Adam Ferrand. He is a teacher at a wonderful university, and in his podcast, he basically runs an entire film school. It's really interesting, really cool. If you can't afford to go to film school, strongly suggest listening to this podcast. Ferrand on Film, go give them a listen. So this week we're talking about the discreet charm of the bourgeoisie. This was my week to pick a film. Since last week we did watch Tempopo, and I wanted to watch something by Luis Buñuel. I was back and forth between a few different films. The reason I picked this one in particular was actually I didn't know I was picking this one. I thought I was picking another of Luis Buñuel's films, but ended up picking this one, which is why I was a little confused when I first started watching it, because I was like, I'm pretty sure this film was in black and white.
Wait, which movie did you mean to pick?
I don't know what it was called, but it was another Luis Buñuel film. What that film was about, it was basically an entire film that took place in one room, and they could never and they just never left the room for the whole film.
Are you talking about an exterminating angel?
Maybe.
Okay.
I don't know, but it doesn't matter because I picked this one. And Andrew, how would you describe this film, which isn't that film?
The film consists of several kind of linked gatherings. It's a handful of gatherings and then a handful of dreams. So it's basically all it is that it's just meetings and gatherings and then dreams among this group of I think 5 or 6 friends and family members that know each other that are, they're rich people, they're high up. One of them is an ambassador, kind of going back and forth between dreams and meetings and dinners and stuff. And that's basically the movie.
Yeah. One interesting thing about this movie is you can't really tell what's real and what's not. And that's true with a lot of Luis Buñuel's films, is there's kind of this certain absurdity under everything. And it's just kind of accepted by all of the characters. That's just how the world of the film works, which is why when it ends up being a dream, as we'll get into later, you don't know that it's going to be a dream because everything in reality is so absurd that when there's stuff that's dream-like, you can't tell what's a dream and what's not, which makes this whole film very surreal, and you're constantly trying to figure out, what's actually going on and what's, just the imagination of one or two of these characters, because everything, even in the real world, is just weird.
Yeah, once they introduce dreams into the movie, you're kind of okay, is this a dream? Is this real? There was a couple times that I called it the scene where where one character shoots another character. As soon as he pulls out the gun to shoot him, I'm like, oh, he's dreaming, isn't he? And then right after that, he wakes up. I'm like, okay, yeah. Once the idea of somewhat dreams that are kind of somewhat real but also not come into play, you're kind of I really don't know. Yeah, like you said, it's kind of hard to tell if it's a dream or not.
So the film opens up. It's nighttime, driving around, credits roll. It's blah, blah, blah. And you're just driving around the city, moving. And I think it's interesting that the opening credit scene is really one of the only scenes that has a ton of movement, slow, very patient kind of camera movements. And the camera movements, it's just absolutely beautiful. The way he'll move the camera and everything kind of moves. But through the film, and a lot of his films are films that are very specifically framed, and everything's supposed to have a very particular place. So I think it's interesting that when the film opens, it's basically just put a camera in the front window of a car, and they're driving around, and they're in France.
So basically the opening scene is that a group of people, a couple, ambassador friend, Rafael Acosta, he's sort of a protagonist. There's not really any protagonist or antagonist, but he's I guess the character that's most interesting to me. And he's the ambassador of a fictional South American country called Miranda. And the couple, I think it's the woman's sister, is also with them. And that's kind of the core characters for the most part. And then they arrive at this woman's house. And they're we're here for the dinner. Ha ha ha. What's up? How's it going? And this woman comes down, Alice. And she's just what? We weren't expecting you at all. They have like this conversation about like, oh, I thought, it was tonight. Like, no, it's actually tomorrow night. Oh, well, what do we do now? Well, I want to go out to eat. We should go out to dinner. And that, they have like this like kind of long conversation where, they're like, there's no dinner here. Maybe we should go out. And Alice is like, I don't know about that. Like, oh, let's go ahead and do it. And then they go and they're like, oh, there's a nearby inn we can go to. And they go to this inn and yeah, and like the door is locked and they're knocking at it and like a waitress comes out. She says like, the restaurant's under new management. We're still open, come in and have some dinner, and they go in to eat.
And when they go into the restaurant, it's absolutely empty. Like there's no one in there except them. And they're really concerned about this because like, well, how can this place be any good if there's no one here? And then they're looking at the menu and they're like, oh, the food's really cheap, which I guess is another suspicious thing because it is important to note that all of these people are part of the bourgeoisie. They're very wealthy. And the entire film is them trying to eat. It's expecting and
So
hoping to
yeah.
by others. Like their entire life revolves around food. Like it doesn't revolve around their work as ambassadors or whatever other work they do. Their entire life is just basically being fed by others. So they're sitting down, they're waiting to eat, and they hear like these wailing cries. And so all three women go up and they walk into this other room. And in the other room is a crying old woman. And next to that crying old woman is a dead man who happens to be the manager, the old manager, and they're just holding awake while they're about to be served dinner. And so the bourgeoisie couples are like, this is kind of weird. We should probably leave. But I love how the like waiter or sommelier or whatever is like, no, stay. Like we're told,
say, we are open.
Yeah. And it's one of those moments in the film where this entire film is so surreal and strange. It has this weird tone to it. And I think part of it is Luis Buñuel plays the film very straight. So like even though there's a lot of moments that are very silly or absurd or weird, Luis Buñuel plays it with a very serious tone, which creates kind of this juxtaposition between what the audience is feeling and what the characters are feeling, which I enjoy a lot. I think that's one of the reasons I love Luis Buñuel's work is because it has this David Lynch quality, pre-David Lynch. You can tell like where Lynch kind of got some of these influences. Luis Buñuel is also someone who's very interested in dreams and what is reality and what isn't. And this is just kind of one of those moments where they're holding awake while they're serving dinner. But of course, the bourgeoisie's couple is like, nah, I don't think we're gonna eat here. So they ended up leaving the inn.
Yeah, that opening, for some reason, I don't know what it is. I find their meetings and their conversations like weirdly compelling, even though they talk about nothing at all. Honestly, that's kind of like my favorite part of the movie is kind of like the build up to kind of like the absurd comedic moment. Mm-hmm. But I do like the opening part where it's revealed it's a corpse. It kind of sets up the movie pretty well for like the rest of the stuff that's going to happen throughout. There's also something like, it kind of reminds me of like a Mikhail Haneke's work. Mm-hmm. Like it kind of reminds me of like Funny Games and Cachet. I don't know why. I was very reminded by those movies just because like those movies are also pretty like bare and a little drab. The movies are bare and drab, but like the thematic elements are very dark and have a lot to do with like money and wealth and colonialism and stuff like that at a very like subtle level. At the surface, like everything is very like very like clean, or everyone's like very wealthy and well off. But, underneath it all, there's like a very, very strong, disgusting, festering like sickness. I think Haneke does it the best, but I think in this movie it does it pretty well too.
Yeah, I think that's one of the weird things about this film, and I would say Luis Buñuel has one of his films is about a guy who just stands on like a post, and that's like the whole film. It's just like a guy standing on a post, and Luis Buñuel does this with almost all his films, which they're not plot driven at all, which I think it's a very difficult thing to do well. And the fact that in this film, it's literally just a sextet of rich people going to sit down for dinner and just like being interrupted and never having that meal. The fact that an entire movie can revolve around that and that can be interesting and intriguing is just so, to me, just so spectacular and amazing. And it just kind of like boggles my mind because I think it's really easy to make a film exciting when you have like a really intense subject. Like the reason people go see Michael Bay films is because it's really easy to make a film entertaining when there's explosions and car chases and all that kind of stuff.
It's awesome. I love it.
But it's so much harder to make a film that's pretty much about nothing. Like it's literally just people sitting around, and the fact that they can make, I mean, the entire film is really just people talking, and to make that entertaining is so challenging. The fact that I think Luis Buñuel does it masterfully in this film is just a nod to how incredibly talented he is, because he did write the film too. So as a writer and a filmmaker.
I think both kinds of movies are equally hard to make. They're just like different. There's like if you're making a Michael Bay movie, like, yeah, you're going to have to think about like how a scene is going to look, trying to think about like where all the like explosions and action and car chases are going to be. Obviously, Discreet Charm doesn't have any of that, but it definitely is like different sensibilities in terms of like thinking about like, okay, how can we make this compelling when it's just like kind of like nothing going on? So yeah, it's definitely it's pretty effective. It's very good. I guess to continue, they're at the embassy in Miranda now, and all the guys are meeting. So it's like the three dudes, and they're talking and stuff. And of course, they just nonchalantly bring up the fact that like they're cocaine dealers, like, which I was like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Like, I assume most ambassadors probably like deal drugs. Like why would they not? They can get away with it. I assume that I assume that United States ambassadors all over the world are drug dealers, probably. But yeah, they're like talking about how like, oh yeah, we got all this cocaine, is great. And I think they bring up the fact that like somebody got caught, right? They're talking about like another ambassador that got caught for like drug dealing. So they're like, that's bad. And they like look outside and they see like this young woman. They're like, hey, look at this. And it's like she's selling these like little like animal dogs. They're like like they're toys and stuff. And I think the one of the guys, I forget which one, he like gets a rifle. He sticks it out the window and he shoots one of the dogs, which is crazy. You're like, oh my God, he's gonna shoot. Like he like just shoots the dog to scare her. And she like looks up and she like runs away into a car. And they're like, what the heck? Why did you like shoot like outside your window? And like, oh, like that woman, she's a part of a terrorist group that wants to kill me. That's pretty funny. That whole part is crazy. They're just like, yeah, we got all this cocaine. All right, I'm gonna shoot real quick, like outside my window.
I love how nonchalant they are about just like the whole situation. Because like even in a diplomatic sack, I love that they get like
it's it's a big sack of like cocaine. Yeah.
And when they're talking about like the other guy being arrested, which is something they do all the time in the movie, and I think this is one of Luis Buñuel's biggest kind of hangups, is this idea of hypocrisy, especially within the wealthy. So you're talking about like how immoral it is to like be selling.
they talk about like how immoral it is to like, they talk about like I think violence a little bit in the movie, right? Because like terrorist groups, they use violence to get what they want. But they're like drug dealers and they're about as, intense and, reactionary, I would say.
Just an absolutely absurd scene, just full of absurdities all around. I love the idea of that woman being a terrorist because she's just like a young like woman, and the whole like group of them are just like young kids. And the idea that these people are like somehow terrorists is just, there's just a certain absurdity to it.
Well, they're terrorists, they're terrorists, right. You know what I mean? Like, they're probably, in the context of the movie, I believe Buñuel was a Marxist. They're probably just like revolutionary, protesters or something like that who happen to also use violence at their disposal as well. So
after this scene, one of the things about all of the scenes is in every scene, they're invited to, pretty much every scene, they're invited to a dinner that will happen in the following scene. It's kind of how all these scenes are linked together. Because in many ways, this is similar to Popo when it's a lot of vignettes that are kind of just like stitched together with like this one underlying idea.
But it's about all the same characters pretty much.
Yeah, I guess it's this following the same characters, but it's like a series of like short films following them as they try to eat dinner. And so they are invited to a dinner at one of the couple's houses.
It's the same couple that they tried to have dinner before. They're having lunch now because they're like, you can have lunch on Saturday instead.
So they go into the house and the couple's not there, and they're like, oh, where's the couple? And the maid, I believe, is like, oh, I'll go up and get them. and they go, and she walks upstairs, and the couple is about to have a passionate.
They really want to have sex. They're really horny. They really, really like want to have sex right now, but they're like, we have to have lunch with these people. So yeah, they're like downstairs and they're like, oh, I wonder where they are. And yeah, the younger couple, I would say, they're like, I know what we should do. And, it shows them like going out the window, which the maid catches them leaving like out the window, and they like go into the bushes in the garden because they want to have sex, but like they can't do it in the bedroom while the people are there because he said that like his like wife or girlfriend is too loud. So they have to go in the bushes in like the garden. That's pretty funny. That sounds like that's probably something that has happened. And like they're like waiting a while. They're friends downstairs and they're like, oh, I wonder what happened. They asked the maid and she's like, they left. I saw them leave. I don't know where they went. And they all like freak out. They're like, oh no, what if like the police are coming? They're going to arrest us. We got to go now. Like they don't even like think about it. The idea once, like as soon as like the fact that like he may like the cops are maybe involved or like he could have been arrested, they just leave immediately. And this is kind of expressed later in their dreams. They have like, even though they're like well off, they still have like, their anxieties are ever present.
And they're just entirely selfish human beings who never think about like anyone but themselves. They're so concerned about their own well-being that they're immediately willing to just be like, yeah, they definitely sold us out. We're leaving. We got to go.
Yeah, they leave immediately. It's pretty funny.
And so the four of them leave. After they leave, a priest comes by, or a bishop, I should say. A bishop comes by. And he comes into the house and he's talking to the maid and he's like, where's everybody? They're like, oh, the couple went out, but they should be back shortly. And he's like, I noticed that your gardener's gone. And she's like, yeah, he was fired like a couple of weeks ago. He's like, oh, that's interesting. So then the bishop walks over to a gardener shed, and then the couple that just had sex comes back, and they're like, where'd everybody go? And they're like, oh, they
have like grass in their hair and stuff. Like,
yeah, like grass all over. Yeah. Like, oh, they just left. And the bishop comes back wearing gardener's clothes. And he's like, hey, like, I'm here to, whatever.
I'm
like,
bishop.
Yeah.
Get out of here.
And they're just like berating their maid and this bishop because he's dressed in like ordinary person's clothes. And they're like, oh, what are you doing, you crazy old man? Get out of here. We don't want you. We never, get out of here. And he leaves and he immediately comes back in bishop's clothes. And I love how immediately they're like so apologetic.
Oh, they're like, oh, sorry.
Which I think it's kind of right. It's partly about the idea of how the bourgeoisie use clothing, but also just wealth to kind of express their status and how important that status is, right? How important it is, like how you look, and how they just define, how they treat people is literally how they look. And it's the same thing, right? The idea is also because he is a bishop, right? It's the same thing with religion, right? They only pretend to be religious because it's the bourgeois thing to do. So the only courtesy they offer to this bishop is because he is, right, of the holy faith. And then you'll see later on that whenever he's wearing the gardener's clothes, they don't treat him like a bishop, right? They just treat him as kind of like a helping hand. Like they just treat him as kind of like a lower class, right? Kind of like the people that work underneath, right? Underground, so to speak.
Like these people really only operate on a surface level when it comes to other people. And the bishop's like, yeah, they come in, they're like, yeah, you're right. They're like, we're sorry. And the bishop's like, well, I want to be your gardener. And they're like, okay, that's kind of weird, but all right, yeah, you can be our gardener if you want. And he's like, yeah, like I remember when I was a kid, like he basically tells his life story about how like his parents were like killed by arsenic poisoning and then the culprit was never like found. And they're like, okay, cool. Well, yep, get to work, like the scene next, which is the women of the group, they go get to a tea house. They go to like a restaurant or something. And they're like, yep, we're going to have some drinks. Can we please have some tea? And they're like, we're out of tea. Like, and they're like, what? Like, it's like the end of the world that they aren't able to get like their precious tea. And they're like sitting there and they're like, okay, I guess we'll just get coffee. And he's like, okay. While they're sitting there, there's like a soldier like in the restaurant and they like kind of talk about them. They're like, why is he, looking at us or whatever. And the guy gets up and he's like, hey, I'm so-and-so, I'm a soldier. can I please tell you about this dream that I had? They're like, okay, that's kind of weird. They're like, right now? You want to talk about it right now?
I love how many times in this movie people just like come up to other people and they tell them just like their entire life story, like, or like just about a dream that they had, like just these complete strangers. And this is already like the second or third instance of just people coming around being like, yeah, I'm just going to tell you like this, like, I don't know who you are, never met you before. Let me tell you this extremely personal story that I had. The soldier sits down and he's like, what was your childhood like? And then they like all go around. They're like, oh, my childhood was pretty.
My childhood was good. Yeah.
It was quite perfect. He's like, well, let me tell you about my terrible childhood.
They're like, okay. It's kind of weird.
Okay. So he goes into the story about, well, it starts with his father, and his father's like, you're going to go to military school.
I hate you.
Okay, it's like this.
Yeah. Oh, and I hate
like,
you.
Awesome, great.
I don't love you.
Oh, yeah, and I hate you. And so the kid's like wandering around, and he's like writing on a mirror with like lipstick.
Yeah.
And he sees his mother behind him, his dead mother. She's like super pale. And he basically gives him an exact plan to murder his father. You're going to get this blue veil.
Is his father.
Yes, which isn't actually his father, because his actual father was killed in... No, it was killed by the guy who claims to be his father in like a
duel.
Sort of, a duel of sorts.
And you see like the ghost of his like dead dad, and he's got his eyes all bloody and stuff. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's a pretty cool effect. It's like he's like has like half a face gone or whatever, and blood's all over. He's like, here's what you're gonna do. You're gonna pour this blue vial into, because apparently the guy drinks a glass of milk at midnight every night. So you're gonna pour this blue vial into his milk, and then that will kill him, and you'll be free. And so he does it. The guy drinks it. He dies. And the boy still ends up going to military school, which apparently was a lovely time.
Yeah, he's like, I liked it. Right, okay. But he's like, yep, that's my story. I killed my dad. And they're like, okay, bye. Like, I love it. Their reaction is just like, they don't even like mention it or talk about it. They don't even like talk about it among themselves. They're just like, because right after that, the waiter comes over and they're like, we don't have any coffee or any drinks at all. And they're like, what? Like, I guess we'll have water. It's just kind of like they're like totally unconcerned with this incredible story that this guy told, because he's a commoner, like he's like it doesn't really matter, it doesn't really like, it's completely like what are they going to say to him? You know what I mean? Like, whoa, that's crazy. They're way more concerned about like their food and drink than anything else, at least in the moment, or themselves, they're thinking about themselves. They're thinking about their food and drink. So I just love how he like tells a story and then they don't say anything at all. The next scene is the one where it's like they're having an affair. So like the ambassador's having an affair with the guy's wife, and like, but they're interrupted by it because, so they're having an affair. It's like the older woman and the ambassador, and they're like about to, get it on. And the husband comes by and he's like, to tell him something about whatever, if she's there, it's like, oh, that's kind of weird that she's here. I didn't expect her to be here. And he's like, yeah, I was going to tell him the same thing. And then they're like, all right, let's leave together. And the ambassador tries to like have her stay and like, so they can have sex. But she's like, no, I have to leave. And he's like, okay, whatever. And she leaves. And then you have like another, the second encounter with the Maoist terrorist person, which she has come to like kill him.
She's like walking to the door, and he sees her walking towards him. So he goes outside and like comes behind her, and he's like, don't move. He's holding the gun to her. He pats her down in a sexual manner, I should add.
Yeah.
He's like, you should make love, not war, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
And then he pushes her inside and she sits down and he pours champagne. And I love that the moment that she sits down, she just picks up a lamp and she just like smashes it.
Yeah, it's good.
And then he does the same thing with the champagne just to prove her, I don't know, Marxist socialist ideals, I guess.
Yeah.
And he's just like, whatever. And he's just talking about, I used to be, back in the day, I used to be a socialist too, but then I learned blah, 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 or whatever. He's going on with his spiels, but as he's going on his spiel, he leaves his gun on the table.
Yeah.
And she grabs his gun and she tries to
Yeah,
shoot him.
she tries it and there's like nothing in it.
But the guy didn't have a loaded gun.
Yeah.
But what he has done is he has taken her gun.
Yeah.
And he knows that her gun is loaded. Now he's pointing at her.
It's fun. Yeah. He just kind of chastises her, kind of advances on her and she refuses. And he's just like, okay, go. And, right when she leaves at the building, there's like his agents capture her and take her away. That part's pretty funny. I don't know. I guess I don't know what to say about it in that, like, I guess it's just kind of like a good scene about, the meeting of the quote unquote bourgeoisie and the Maoist terrorist is kind of like kind of shows sort of the eclipsing of any kind of like, I guess, revolutionary action that may be presented in like the Western world, whether it be Europe or the United States. At least that's my interpretation of it. After this part, you get like the sequence where it's basically like several like aborted dinner parties, one after another. They try to have dinner with the couple again at the house. And they're like, all right, we're about to eat. We're about to have some food. And then all of a sudden, a huge group of army officers just show up. They just come out of nowhere. They all file in. It's like a dozen of them.
And they're like, we're here. We're ready to feast. They're like, oh, I didn't expect you till tomorrow. And they're like, oh, well, I guess we got here early. And they're like, oh, well, I guess we'll try to prepare something. So they're scrambling around getting like, I don't know, all these different food things. And, they're putting tables together and blah, blah, blah. They're all talking to each other. Well, while this is going on, like while they're preparing the food, I believe it's the general talks to Raphael and he's like trying to talk about the country that Raphael is the ambassador of. And it's very clear that this general has no idea what's going on. Like he's like, oh yeah, like I know all about your country and blah blah blah. He's like, no, it's in South America actually. And he keeps talking about it. And the general has like, no idea where this place is.
He like keeps getting it wrong over and over again. It's like, oh, it's that. Yeah. He doesn't know what to talk about with them. Everybody's like conversations in the movie are interesting just because like they have like nothing to say really. They don't want to like implicate themselves in anything, I guess you might say. Like they're completely because the things that they do and the way that they get their money is through means that are very morally reprehensible, you know what I mean? At least to an extent, like dealing drugs or war, whatever business practices they're doing, I assume, it's, their enterprises are dirty. So whenever they the only thing that they're kind of like interested is in like food and drink. So it's kind of interesting that they always get interrupted with it. And they always get interrupted by things that they're like afraid of or something like that. So you have like the dinner party with the army officers, and one of the army officers like tells it once again, it's another dream where he talks about, it's basically like a weird kind of like, it's fine, it's like a dream where he's like wandering around a destroyed town and he meets like a couple dead friends and he meets his dead mom and it's like very sad, and he tells the story and of course they don't react at all. Actually they do react. There's some people that are like, you should tell the dream about that or whatever, like I guess he has like really great dreams. And they're like, no, we got to leave. And the colonel like invites them to dinner. And basically when the colonel invites them to dinner, you basically get this like series of like anxiety dreams with the characters, basically, like when the colonel invites them to dinner. I think the first one is that the young guy it has a dream about like going to dinner and they're having dinner and stuff. And they're like, all right, let's get ready. We're having dinner. The help brings like a platter of like chickens and they fall on the ground and they're like plastic. And the guy's like, wait, what's this? And then like, of course, like the background opens up and it turns out they're like on a stage and they're like being laughed at and booed at. And they're all like, what the heck? And they all like run away. They really do look like they're scared. It's pretty funny. And they're all like, what the heck? Like we're on stage. And the young guy is like sweating and he's like, oh my God, and he wakes up and it's like, oh, okay, it's a dream. And it's kind of like, I missed a math test type dream. You know what I mean? Like, it's an anxiety ridden dream where, he's the guy is like concerned about being laughed at or concerned about being watched or viewed on stage. You know what I mean? He doesn't want to be put on a stage, so it's kind of like it's like a sort of nightmare anxiety dream where his like fears, are put on display for us in his dream. And that one's pretty interesting. I like that one.
Yeah, I think that's one of my favorite vignettes of the film because it's the entire idea is that the bourgeoisie is constantly, they really are part of a play. They're always acting. They're never.
Yeah, they are. They're very, yeah.
They can never actually be themselves. They're constantly being someone else, right? They're constantly reading lines. They have to pretend to be someone. It's as if they are in a theater and they are being watched, right, by the public, by the people, and everything that they do is scrutinized by them, especially when you think of like an ambassador or a political figure. These are people who are constantly performing, and the terror that people will realize that you're just a performer, that you are just a person in theater is just absolutely terrifying to them. So I love that sort of sequence, real sequence when you realize that they're on a stage and their like lines are being read to them by just like, like a stagehand or something, right? He's like reading their lines as if everything they do is just performance, as if nothing they do matters, as if everything they do is just right, just to
as if their stuff is like, as if like what they're about to say is already like predetermined. Like it's not really like anything that they say isn't really like an original idea or anything off the cuff. It's all like you said, like predetermined or pre-written inside their mind.
Pretty terrifying idea.
Yeah, it seems kind of difficult.
But he wakes up from the dream. And he's like, oh, whew, just a dream. His wife's there. She's reading a book or something. And he gets a call. And they're like, hey, I thought you were coming to this party. And he's like, oh, yeah, I'm coming. So they go to the party.
It's at the Colonel's.
It's at the Colonel's house, right?
So the ambassador is there, and he's the ambassador of Miranda, this made-up South American country.
That's right.
And about like 3 or 4 times, a person will come up to them and be like, "Oh, I heard there's tons of drug dealers and murderers in Miranda. Is that true?" And he's like, "No, it's not really true." And then he meets another person. They're like, "I heard it's a shithole, Miranda." Like these people like keep like insulting the country to him as if like he's kind of like, I don't know, like his own like home country, and he's just kind of like, like, no, that's not true. And finally, the last guy comes up as the Colonel, and the Colonel gets very like confrontational with him about Miranda, about like how it's a bad country or something like that. Mm-hmm. And the Colonel, I think, like hits him, and of course the ambassador's like, all right, and he pulls out a gun and he just loads in one and just completely loads into the Colonel. And like I said, like right when he pulls out the gun, I'm like, oh, he's dreaming. Like people wouldn't talk like this. And of course he does. He wakes up because, of course, the ambassador is scared that people will confront him about. He's almost like he's like almost like ashamed or embarrassed of his country. You know what I mean? Like of his home country in a way. Like it's still his home, and in the dream he defends it, but he doesn't want to be confronted. He's of course like the dream, I guess, sort of shows that he's afraid that people will confront him about Miranda, or like try to talk to him about the country in a way where they're like criticizing it. And, in France, around these people, they're all having a good time. You know what I mean? I like that one too. That one is also pretty good. But of course, like we said, he wakes up and it's like, oh, okay, it's a dream.
I love this thing. Once again, they're sitting down, they're about to eat, they're getting ready to eat. They're talking about their bourgeois stuff, which is basically nothing. And someone knocks on the door and they're like to the maid, go get the door, go see who that is. And of course, it ends up being just this like giant group of, well, not giant, but a group of police officers. And they come into the house and they're like, what are you doing here? And he's like, oh, are you, blah, 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 blah. And he's like, yeah, that's me. He's like, oh, you're under arrest.
Yeah, and he keeps doing it to each person. Are you so-and-so?
Because then the next guy comes, he's like, you can't do this to us. He's like, oh, are you, blah, blah, blah. He's like, well, yes. And he's like, oh, you're also under arrest. He does that a third time. And the women are like, you can't do that, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, oh, arrest him too. He's like, what? But we're women. You can't arrest us. And he's like, no, we're just going to take everybody.
They're all very entitled. I like how the women are like, we're women. You can't arrest us. Which I guess they didn't do anything. I guess they're not really like drug dealers. It's not established that they're drug dealers. But yeah, it's funny. We're women. You can't arrest us. They're a little entitled. It's funny, they get arrested and I'm like, why are you arresting us? I think it's evident, they're drug dealers.
Good reason to arrest people.
Most of the time. Yeah. But yeah, they get like arrested and like, they're like in the jail cell all together. It's like it's very like comical. They're like all in the same jail cell. Like it's like a Western that has like the one jail one jail for everybody. And they kind of tell like this little anecdote where it's like Bloody Sergeant's Day. They kind of show the story about like a sergeant who like tortures like a young protester or something like that. And they're like, oh, it's Bloody Sergeant's Day, we need to leave. They don't really explain it too well, but that's the story. And they're like, all right, we gotta go. Because I think it's like a ghost story, you know, it's like the ghost of the sergeant is going to be around or whatever. And they see him, you know, they're like in the jail cell and the Bloody Sergeant comes and I think he like opens the jail cell. Mm-hmm. And then I think that's when one of the characters wakes up from the dream, right?
Yeah, it's like the detective or captain or something.
Right. The detective, yeah.
He wakes up and he's like, oh, you know, the sergeant who supposedly does things like, you know, what's going on? He's like, oh, I had this terrible dream that you released all of our prisoners.
And then, yeah, he gets...
here's a call, right? I love that. I love this thing that they do, which is like whenever they give any sort of like important information, it's always just like overridden by just some loud noise. So like anytime there's anything important happening, like you don't actually hear the conversation because he gets a call from some ambassador person and he's like, you got to release these people. And he's like, what? I'm not going to release these people. Why would I do that? And he's like, oh, let me tell you a reason. And then he goes into the spiel. And of course, as the spiel's going on, there's like a plane going on in the background or something. He's like, well, I didn't hear that. And he does it again. The exact same thing happens. And he's like, oh, okay. So he hangs up and then he tells the sergeant and sergeant's like, well, why do they need to be released? And of course, as he gives the explanation for a third time, there's like typewriters going on that just like overpower anything that they say.
And they're like, okay, well, we'll release them. You know, they get what they want, right? Like we're rich people. Why would we be arrested? You know, like why would we go to jail? Like that's not something that happens. They're like having dinner again. They finally get to have their dinner, their beautiful dinner. And they're like eating and they're like, oh, wow, this roast is delicious. This is awesome. I love it. And then out of nowhere, like these like gangster looking guys come in with guns and they're like, all right, get up. And they kind of like push them into like a part of like the living room and they just mow them down. You know, they just like machine gun them. And they're like, all right, we got them. And then they hear like a sound and they look under the table and it's the ambassador. He's like eating like some meat and they shoot him too. And I think when they shoot him, I think the ambassador wakes up, them being arrested, them being killed by a hit squad, you know, all these things, you know, once again, you know, they're it's kind of a combination of like anxiety and entitlement, right? They don't believe they deserve to be arrested for what they did, even though they're like breaking the law, but they're also scared about getting arrested because they theoretically could be arrested for breaking the law, right? Because they're dealing drugs, you know? So it's like, you know, that's what they're most scared about, you know, being humiliated and not being able to be like a rich person anymore.
It reminded me of that scene in Tampopo where the guy gets arrested and like after he's arrested, he's like, just let me have like one more morsel of food. It's very similar to the idea of, you know, this guy's literally willing to risk his life and, you know, ends up dying, quote unquote, at least in the dream, because he wants to eat that roast. Like he's so obsessed with his own pleasure and luxury that he is unable to like ever to see beyond it, even if his own life is at risk. Like he would rather eat, like be in pleasure and just slaughtered than just, you know, living.
They killed him, and like I said, like the ambassador wakes up, and the final scene is we've had this reoccurring scene where throughout the film where like the six characters are walking silently on this like long country road, and we've gotten that scene intermittently, and the movie of course ends with that scene where, you know, it's them walking like to nowhere, I guess is the idea, right? Like they're kind of like going nowhere. And when I say going nowhere, I mean, I guess they're not really going to reach, I guess, a place that is of real pleasure, I guess you might say. Not pleasure in terms of like food or drink or money, but pleasure in terms of, I don't know, like a fulfilling or real or authentic life, I guess you might say. At least that's how I interpret it.
Yeah, their life is literally meaningless. They're just walking. I mean, their entire life is basically just walking to and from nowhere. It's just, you know, the participation of walking, like that's all their life is just like existing. Like they have no reason to be alive. They have going for them. They have, you know, they're not going anywhere. They're not doing anything. Their entire life is basically just walking down an empty road.
And that's how the movie ends.
Well, Andrew, final thoughts and rating?
think I'll give the movie like a pretty solid 7 out of 10. It's very good. I really enjoyed it. Like I said, it's oddly compelling, even when nothing is being said. I like that stuff a lot. Um, I do like when it kind of like dips in and dips out of like dreams, and and I do think it's the construction of the movie is very interesting in that they keep trying to have dinner and have lunch and stuff, and they keep being interrupted by all these like different weird things that keep transpiring. The movie is pretty drab, but everybody in the movie is good. I like the writing, which I think was why it was so compelling. And some dream sequences, they're fine, they're cool. And it's a pretty funny movie too. And I think Buñuel like really kind of cuts into. I think he does really cut really well into kind of the bourgeoisie class of the upper class echelon of at least European. Yeah, I really enjoyed it, and I will watch more of Buñuel's stuff.
I am going to give this movie an 8 out of 10. It's not my favorite Buñuel film. I think he has some films that are just more. I guess the best way to say it is just have more to say than this film. Not that this film doesn't have a lot to say. I think it's a really interesting film. It's a really intriguing film. There's something magnificent about the way Luis Buñuel frames his films, and there's just so much movement going on, like not just with the characters, but also with the camera. And it feels almost nonsensical, but at the same time, there's just this, it's almost like watching a ballet in a certain sense, because like the camera just has these like big sweeping movements on these dollies and these cranes, and it's just constantly moving. And even when nothing's really happening, I think that's part of the reason why, at least for me, I feel so intrigued in the film, because it's not like they just put a camera on sticks and just sit it there and have them talk for like 20 minutes. The camera's just like constantly moving from like character to character, and you have almost this, it's not as if you are one of the characters within it, but you have almost this like godlike perspective in the way that you can kind of see things and the way it moves. And it's just so fascinating and interesting. And I think Buñuel has a lot to say about bourgeoisie and the different classes and just the absurdity of the whole thing. And I think this film is very funny in a kind of dark and drab way, as you put it. I really enjoyed watching the film again. All right, y'all. Thank you for listening. You can find me at AustinLugo12.
You can find me on Twitter at AUHarp24. You can also add me on Letterboxd at RetroAndrew, the O being a 0.
And you can find this podcast wherever you hear podcasts. You can also find us on YouTube and Instagram at With Nothing to Say Podcast. And again, shout out to our amazing and wonderful editor, Shannon. She is the best. She does the work of God himself. Literally, no one could do what she does. So thank you, and thank you all for listening.
Thanks, guys.
We did it again.
Yeah.